Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at CESJ.org.
Okay, this is Dave Hamill. We got a conference call going. I'm going to basically put this forth to the podcast listeners. So I had a couple of things I've been wanting to discuss with everyone, but everyone got on this call because we were wanting to reach people who are mostly Bernie Sanders supporters and people who are generally in favor of socialism and present another way to address wealth disparity and discuss it, but we didn't have any inquisitive participants who had not heard of our ideas before, but we have some of our regulars who I consider to be experts, and so I was going to take this opportunity to talk about a few things, and I guess we should start with the socialism outreach. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We've already talked about it some. Why don't we start with Joyce? Joyce, you haven't said too much. I appreciate you coming back on. What do you think is a way to reach people who are interested in socialism? Do you have any ideas?
Well, first, thank you for including me in this conversation. I have a real problem with reaching out to people who are committed Bernie Sanders people or quote unquote socialists, because they operate from a framework which really has to erode before you can talk to them about our ideas. I find it easier to talk to them about the Native American way of looking at property. You know, they may know nothing about common ownership. The source of the product, you know, like the apple tree. You can own the apples, but you can't own the tree because you had nothing to do with the creation of the tree. And so anything that's a natural resource or that belongs to the community, but you can own the fruit of it. And that's a Native American approach to ownership. And that the socialists understand.
Maybe we could reach people who think that way and talk about the Citizens Land Bank or Citizens Land Co-op.
Can I interject something, Dave? First of all, I know in the pure sense what Bernie Sanders represents is socialism, but they have carved out their own definition of democratic socialism, which honors private property and the means of production, but wants to see taxation pay for what they believe are American rights, right to higher education, health care. But that's what they're talking about. So when you call them a socialist, they get riled up about it. As they'll say, we're democratic socialists.
Could I make a comment about that? There are two things.
Yes, please.
One is if someone doesn't understand the concept of private property, then it's almost impossible to talk about socialism in a clear way either. For example, when Joyce was talking about the Native American approach to ownership, first of all, there were many different tribes and they had different systems, but for example, some of the Plains Indians, like the Cheyenne, who were nomadic, they didn't own the land because they didn't need to, but for tools or horses, they recognized private property in those things. And so, no one else in the tribe could come and take your knife or your horse. They're violating your private property. So I think we have to be very specific in, first of all, defining private property as the right of the owner to the fruits of whatever that person owns, as well as the right to control the thing that is owned. So when Gary, when you were talking about democratic socialism supporting the idea of private property, I would question that, because as soon as you say, they support paying for things like free health care, free education through the tax system, that's a way of violating private property. So I think.
Yeah, I wanted to just inject about that, because Bernie always refers to Sweden or Denmark or Finland or Norway, and I did my doctorate studies in Sweden, so I lived there for 2 years, and it's a private property system, but they're taxed at about 60% on personal income. But they have a cultural agreement that this is a good thing to do, is to support education of our children, or to have health care for everyone from birth to old age, and that's what it's about, and it works for them. All those countries, the Scandinavian countries, it works, but they're still a private property based country, and they have concentrated ownership.
There are some cultures that you have so much agreement on what's going on, and there's very little corruption, and just about any system would work if you have that kind of cooperation and lack of corruption. And that's because those cultures are just raised that way, basically. But when you look at the entire world, unfortunately, the other cultures don't operate that way. But if it's okay with you guys, I wanted to go back to the idea of reaching out to people who do have interest in that type of system Joyce was describing, and concentrating on the Citizens Land Co-op aspect. Can anyone comment about that?
The Citizens Land Bank is basically a for-profit enterprise, but it's owned. Back when Norm and I and Louis Kelso, we had Agenda 2000, we developed concepts for urban renewal where the displaced residents, and in those days it was residential displacement, would own through a land bank that property that the taxpayers are putting into to improve. Because what happens is the government comes in, improves the infrastructure so that hotels can be built or other business high rises or whatever. And so a lot of taxpayer monies go into that, but it always benefits these elite owners. So the concept is to develop a mechanism where the people being displaced would own that whole property, that whatever that is, and all the benefits of the infrastructure in place, and then would lease out the right to build this hotel or this thing. So they would collect the lease payments, and that would be an income stream for those residents. So that's sort of the concept of the land bank.
Right. What if we took it even to a more simple concept, since we were talking about apple trees? Let's say that there was a town that had a apple orchard. Is there any reason why the entire orchard could not be owned by all the residents of the town? And would that not mean that every resident would have one voting share in a profit corporation that operates the orchard, and they would also receive a dividend on the operation of the entire orchard after the crops are sold, and all the operating expenses and the labor and fertilizer and all that kind of stuff is
cost of doing business,
every year.
Right?
Yeah,
right.
Dave,
that's exactly it. That's it.
Well, Dave, I would nuance it a bit. I think what you just described would be a typical, let's say, an ESOP company, a corporation that had...
Not if the people who own it aren't working there but just happen to live there.
Well, here's the thing, is that you can say who is an owner, and they have a share in a portion of what is produced. They own that, the rights to what that enterprise produces. But just distinction about the Citizens Land Cooperative or Land Bank, it's really meant to be an entity, as Gary said, it's a for-profit corporation that owns a certain amount of land. And its sole purpose, and it also would own, I would say, infrastructure. But its purpose is land planning and use. And as Gary said, the leasing out of land for different purposes, and that's basically the stream of income. So the idea would not be that it owns the productive enterprises on the land, but it's allowing, for example, the orchard to come in and say, we want to use this area because it's got fertile soil. It's great for apples. And so we're going to pay a rent to the Citizens Land Bank to be, using that plot of land. And we have to be really careful and specific when we're talking about our proposals, that this represents share ownership, and those shares are the property of the shareholder and no one else, not the government. The government doesn't have the right to just decide, we're going to tax you 60% and we'll dole out all the benefits to everyone. It's saying to the shareholder, you're going to get that stream of income. Yes, there may be government services that are needed, and you're going to, through your income tax, you'll pay for that. But essentially, you want to empower each citizen as an owner to be able to make choices as to, where they want to get their education, where they think they can get the best medical care, et cetera. So, that's the difference between what we're talking about and other approaches, which are, well-intentioned. They're trying to address poverty and income inequality, but they're doing it in a more centrally owned and controlled way, even though it may be subtle, such as in Sweden, where you can have private property in certain things. But frankly, if the government comes and takes 80% or 70% of your income, then that becomes a violation of private property.
Speaking of private property, I need to read some more Marx, because he said
Karl Marx.
Karl Marx said that he's the person that actually came up with the socialism thing, and I think what he said is abolish private property, but there's other kind of something called personal property. And when you get in an argument with these people, they say, yeah, you can still have personal property. And, that's just crazy to start making all these delineations. You ought to be able to own what you want to own,
Well, Dave, first of all, the Bernie Sanders and the Bernie Sanders followers do not want to abolish private property. They do not want the government or the collective to own.
Yeah.
Well, some socialists do, but we're talking about the democratic socialism, espoused by Bernie Sanders and his followers. As regard to education, the other factor is they would say that, well, there would still be choice. It'd just be, you still choose whatever school you want. Private schools would still be there. It's just that the government provided educations and universities and things like that would be tuition free.
What does Mike Greeny have to say on this subject?
Well, first of all, there's a couple of misconceptions floating around. Marx did not invent socialism. The modern phase of socialism actually began in the early 19th century. The basic principle was probably best expressed by Henri de Saint-Simon in his 1825 book, The New Christianity, which I can't pronounce the French title, but the basic principle there is to improve society and raise the lot of the poor by any means necessary. regardless of any natural rights of life, liberty, or property that any individual might have, the well-being of the collective overrides everything. And that is the basic principle of socialism. Now, this is why some forms of socialism can permit private property, but the key is it's not recognized as a right, a natural right inherent in the human person, which means that anybody with enough power, meaning the state or the community or the big bully down the street, if he has enough power, can take what you have simply because he does have that power. You have no natural right to own what you own. That is the problem.
And that's what's good about living in the U.S.
It's natural to the human person.
Right.
Well, here's the thing from my perspective. You know, I mean, even if we get all of our policies adopted and our actual financial mechanisms implemented, including the equal allotment every year of GDP for, you know, capital credit loans repayable out of the investments, it's still going to take, at least if we implement it right now, 25 years before we're going to actually see the impact of all this.
We would start seeing a lot of effect within just a few years, but I'm sure it would take a long time.
Well, it's going to take a long time for people to get to earn enough income from their ownership of productive assets to be able to pay on their own for health care, for education, and all this stuff. And so in that regard, you know, I think what Bernie Sanders followed, this is a short-term, immediate necessity way to do it, you know, starting with free education and a system of free health care.
Yeah. Gary, are you saying that because it would act like an investment that you would have to pay off with future dollars, the investment part of it, and then start earning money on your investment? And it would take time to ramp up to get to the amount of money it would take to pay for health care, that sort of thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like a 401k. I mean,
but the problem there is that you're looking only at the capital owners. You have to look at it systems-wide. For example, if we got capital homesteading in tomorrow, and every single child, every woman, every man got their annual credit allotment and used it to the full, you would see full employment within a decade.
Yeah, that's true, because those investments would be in real assets that are like, you know,
because you would increase consumption power, you'd increase the demand for new capital, you'd increase production, and there would not be time enough to invent the machines to replace these workers.
Yeah,
but in the meantime, even if you did, it would still take time, and within 20 to 30 years, you would see people earning a significant portion of their consumption income from ownership of capital to replace the wage income that, as you know, technology advances, they would start replacing wage workers. But at that point, it wouldn't matter.
Because then you would own the machines by that point, correct?
There would be significant ownership within 3 to 7 years, because that's pretty much the average lifespan of a lot of industrial assets. Most places, by the time they finish paying off a machine, there's a better machine available, and if you don't get it, you're not going to be operating as efficiently as possible.
Right.
It pays people to replace these things as fast as they can the moment they're fully depreciated, even if they may have a useful life left. You know, what we're talking about for the Capital Homestead Act is not the replacement assets. The original assets and the replacement assets will continue to belong to the people they belong to now. What we're talking about is the additional growth ring.
Yeah. Now, this is a big challenge because our industry seems to be on a projectile of hogism, greed. And what we're basically, I mean, there's two sides of this, but one side is they're going to see it as, well, you're taking away my right to continue to build and accumulate more wealth in my businesses that I own.
You own what you own now. You don't own the future.
No, I understand that. I totally understand that. Believe me, I'm just giving you this perspective that I hear about, and they're still going to fight against it. And then you got the Supreme Court going to come into this thing, and I wonder how they will rule on that.
Well, the Supreme
Because
Court has
he's
been
got-
attempting to erode property since 1857 when they decided that the state has the right to say what a person is.
How
Well,
do you reverse a ruling like that?
You
That everything.
overturn a law case from 1873 called the Slaughterhouse Cases. And that will bring back the original intent of the 14th Amendment, which, if you actually read it, it says that every single human being has natural rights and the state can't take them away. Slaughterhouse case opinion turned upside down and said, oh, what it means is that the state can decide who is a person and who has rights. Opposite of what the amendment means.
Right, but Mike, to get back to the original discussion on really how with capital homesteading, if we implemented it today, when would people start experiencing the benefits? And
I think they'd start experiencing the benefits right away, simply because it would take about a quarter to start getting things ramped up. That's a quarter meaning 90 days. You would instantly see an upturn in the productive capacity. Companies would have to start hiring because they now have the money to invest in new capital. And as they pay the workers, consumption demand would increase. Now, you would start to see the upswing right away. That's why I say within 3 to 7 years, you would see, and this is all with zero inflation too, between 7 to 10 years, you'd get full employment. And my very crude estimates that I worked out, which probably need a lot of improvement, is that you would completely get rid of the national debt within 60 years because people would start paying for themselves what welfare and entitlements and transfer payments are paying for now.
Mike, I was also going to mention that you have to look at how the tax reform would also be encouraging corporations to pay out their profits rather than paying them.
Everything that we're looking at is extremely conservative. I realize it's a dirty word to most people, but for accountants, it's a great thing. Now, what you do is that if we're looking solely at the new increment of new capital added each year, in all forms, then you would probably get the effects we're talking about within, you would see a booming economy within 3 years. Within 7 to 10, you'd see full employment, and then everything else that I said. But once you have corporations paying out all earnings because they don't need the earnings to finance new capital, they're doing that by selling new shares.
Right.
Now, what happens is that if you make dividends tax deductible at the corporate level, but fully taxable as regular income at the individual level, except when you're using it to acquire new capital through your capital homestead account, what happens is that it's suddenly very, very profitable for corporations to pay out dividends. And dividends are a direct charge against retained earnings, which means you're recapturing all the income taxes you paid to get those retained earnings into the company. The government paying you to pay out dividends because you don't get taxed on them.
When you talk about that, I think that needs to be kind of simmered and simplified down, because when you talk about the companies will have that incentive, because that shows people a little more, a little bit more practically the practicality of it. Make sense? But you get pushback on that. You really get pushback in that area, and then I get stuck on how to explain that out, because people say, well, companies are never going to go for that. But when you break it down into how they would be incentivized to do that, like what you're talking about, and it's hard to explain.
The easiest way to think is that everybody knows that corporations retain earnings. What happens is when they start paying out those retained earnings as dividends, that turns into consumption income. That provides an additional stimulus to the economy, which is a natural stimulus, which is much, much better than the government creating debt to try to stimulate the economy.
Right.
As every dollar of consumption income that you increase means that there is that much more demand for consumption goods, which means that much more demand for capital goods, which means that there is that much more demand for labor, and you're creating jobs. naturally, not as a drain on people's purses, but because you're going to make money doing it, which is a huge incentive for companies, because why should we pay money to create jobs when we can make money by creating jobs?
Right.
There's a wrinkle in one part of that, and that is that first of all, most major corporations, and that's what we're talking about because they're more risk-free for capital credit. They're very concentrated in their ownership. You know, a few people really own the bulk of that, and then there's the general public stockholders and pension plans and stuff. But here's the point: the 98% of all corporate growth is either through retained earnings or through actual corporate debt. Those two benefit that ownership class. Now, right now, our corporate income tax is what, 35% now? It's been lowered. That's not enough incentive. We got to get that back up to like 90%, because 35%, those kinds of people, if they have a hoggish mentality and they want to own the world, which it appears so many of them do, they don't care about the 35% savings and earnings. They don't care. The other side of it is new enterprises can rise up and compete with these guys, and they can be totally financed. But then the challenge is the insurance aspect on the capital credit, because that replaces the requirement for having savings to pledge against a default of a loan you have. So the problem there is they're startup companies. They're going to be, measured as high risk initially until they totally get off the ground. So we have to deal with that. I think we have to deal with that, how we bridge that and make it lock solid that these major corporations are going to actually pay out 100% of their earnings to the owners of the company and finance their future growth in ways that they extend capital credit is extended to buy new shares that they do, which means the current owners, they still own everything that they've owned before, but their opportunity, unless they go through the capital homestead account process to expand their wealth, their personal wealth, is shut out.
Yes, but Gary, if you have capital credit insurance in place, and it's not like these companies, yes, there probably will be failures for sure, but you have to have anytime you go getting finance from a bank, you have to have a feasible, you have to meet a criteria of feasibility, or they're not going to look at you. It's not going to be just everyone.
You're missing the elephant in the living room here.
The
corporations under capital homesteading aren't getting the credit. It's the capital homesteader. Let's assume a 35% corporate income tax rate and a 5% interest rate. What is the interest rate you're paying for growth if you do that? The effective rate, 40%.
Yeah.
What happens? What's the effective interest rate?
Yeah, because the other part would be dropped, right?
Zero.
Right.
That's the greatest incentive in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think this needs, it would be really great. This kind of stuff could be charted out as an example, so that people can see here's the earnings, coming in, and if this was applied, these would be applied to future growth and all that kind of stuff.
You're talking about a model,
right?
Yeah.
And I think
so that people can see see how
That's
this really looks.
Yeah. Gary, I think it's also important to address one of your other points, and what you just said. I think we should develop this a diagram showing how all the money flows to finance the capital growth and is repaid. But you made one point that needs to be answered, and that was capital credit insurance, that it's paid. You were saying that it would be paid for out of past savings or past accumulation.
Replaces the requirement of past savings.
Right, and it's also where it comes from.
That's right.
It's important to mention that the capital credit insurance is part of the capital homestead financing, that as the Federal Reserve creates the money that's for the capital homesteader to invest, a portion of that is kept back, is discounted to cover the cost of the local bank and the Federal Reserve, but also a portion is held back for capital credit insurance, which will differ in terms of the risk of the investment. So it's, I think it's important for people to understand.
So that's the FHA concept, yeah.
Well, no, it's not quite the same thing, because there's no, for example, taxpayer dollars involved. This is purely created credit and insurance. So I think we have to also point out that in the interim, we want to make sure that people can be, to the maximum extent possible, be able to pay for the things they need, such as health care and insurance. So the Capital Homestead Act, its tax reforms enable people to do that, even if they aren't, able to generate a fully self-sufficient capital income. They are not taxed on, we set it at $30,000 of income.
Yeah, $100,000 for a family,
and $20,000 for every dependent. So a family of four would not pay income tax or payroll tax until they earned more than $100,000. So still could avoid having the government step in to dole out people's, whatever they need. We want to make people self-sufficient. Where they cannot be self-sufficient, that's where you still would have welfare available to get them to that point until they're generating enough capital income. So I think the more that people can see, as you were saying, we need to show the flow of, how money is created, how it flows through the Capital Homestead account to invest in the companies, which, in order to participate in this, they have to pay out all the profits on those shares and have full voting rights on the shares as well. So question about why would they even care about the taxes? Well, they can continue financing their growth in the old way that they did, but frankly, it's going to be, as Mike pointed out, a lot more expensive to finance their growth that way, much more risky. In this way, you're putting the equity. If you're going to get Capital Homestead financing, those shares that are being sold have to be full dividend payout, full voting shares. If you don't want to participate as a company in that, you don't have to, but that means you're going to be paying, if you're using debt, you're going to be paying expensive debt, or, as Mike points out with retained earnings, really what those end up doing is you don't use that cash. That becomes like collateral in order to get financing.
Don, where does the 30,000s and the 20,000s come from? Because we're saying that there's no tax under 100,000, but what happens to the people who aren't even, they're making 25,000 or 50,000?
Well, as we said, that this is where you would have welfare, play a part until they were self-sufficient. The point is that you're going to reduce the amount of the need for government redistribution. You're going to have a more competitive economy because you'll have many more enterprises come into the picture. So you're going to have downward pressure on prices. I think the point that Mike was also making, we have this tremendous capacity to produce all sorts of goods and services. The problem is most
people don't have money to buy them.
Yeah, that's right, and they're not able to produce in such a way that they get the money to buy these things. As the businesses produce, they're also automatically creating the consumers for those goods. You'll have fewer people needing it. You'll have more affluence, and also, you'll have through the tax system we're proposing the means to determine, okay, this much is going to be needed by this number of households. The single rate tax covers that, plus whatever obligations remain under Social Security, plus whatever costs there are for, defense or whatever. You'll be able to determine what are the actual costs that we need to cover in the coming year. And the tax rate will be geared towards that, once for all incomes over the exempted level. So with the increased growth, we're going to have a way of really, it's also going to be a more stable system so that we never have more dollars in the system than we need, and that as we produce, we will also have corresponding purchasing power spread out broadly. Because as you know, as a Californian, you can only spend so much on consumer goods. And so, it's to the benefit of business to be able to sell to as many as possible.
Yeah, that's the plan for the future. I still want to come back to the new companies wanting to compete with some of these major corporations, and they've left, outsource their production for lower cost production and also to gain market access to other markets that they can sell their products and services in, because our market is drying up.
Under the scenario that we're talking about, startups with very good ideas and a good product are going to be basically in hog heaven. With the existing wealth, they can't consume it all. They want to reinvest it, but they can't invest it in the companies that are participating in the capital homesteading. What are they going to do? They're going to go out hunting for these small startups that they may do well, they may do terrible, they may do terrific. But these people are gamblers, and some of them are going to pay off big. Now, some startups are not going to work, but that always happens anyway. But the ones that do will pay off. And then they can become regular capital homesteading companies as well.
Companies then that are going to spring up to compete with these major international American corporations now.
The startups.
Green energies, new technology companies.
Until they prove themselves, they won't be eligible for capital credit, the capital homestead credit.
Right.
And the insurance won't be a factor with them. It's only when they've proven themselves with the money by the venture capitalist and then buy them out, probably at a huge profit for the venture capitalist, which they'll have earned because they risked.
Mike, when you say venture capitalist, are you talking about somebody that doesn't own them? They just put the capital up and get some sort of...
That depends on the arrangement that the company makes.
Don't use capital, use money. Put the money in.
Have you seen Shark Tank?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, you'll notice that,
I can't remember.
Some of them will say, I'll do this if you'll give me 51% of the company. One fellow, I noticed, I can't remember which one it was, would say almost always, I'll do it for a share of the profits for X number of years, and then I'll be out.
Right. And that's really where you want to go, because you don't want them
what you'll say is, I'll take 75%, but you'll have the right to buy me out after 20 years. Or some such thing.
When we did Hop One, for instance, Hop One, nobody was going. The person putting up the money would get. They wouldn't even get a share. They were going to get a fee or interest on the money that they put, like 8% on the money that they put up. But once that 8% was paid and they were paid back, they went away. They didn't own any of the company, the startup.
Yeah, that's another way of doing it.
I think this is a really important point because we've been asked in the past, how will small businesses and startups benefit from capital homesteading? Because we said that in order to get the credit or to invest the credit, the investment has to be sound. And so it has to pass the feasibility test. It has to be, have customers, and it has to be kind of almost a guaranteed thing. And a startup is obviously, you can't promise that. It's very speculative. But the point is you're going to free up a lot of money that is now, only being able to be used by the rich or being retained. You'll now have another source of, traditional finance for these small businesses to get loans, for example, or as Mike said, you have venture capitalists or even capital homesteaders. They got this income that's coming to them. What do they do with the income? Well, it might be a very attractive idea for a capital homesteader to take the dividend income they got and help start up a new green energy business. So I think you're going to see a flourishing of a lot of new businesses, a lot of creative ideas, too, that you really can't have as much under today's system.
And in contracts. They had customers that they could show would produce the dollars they were asking for to start up. And if they could have done that, because if you're trying to get money from a bank in the traditional way, you have to be in business for like 3 years.
Right.
You have to show that you're operating. Startups, a whole different world. For startups, if they really have a feasible, they have contracts in hand, all they need is the money, then that would be a huge feasibility enterprise, feasible enterprise for a capital homesteader to invest in.
Right. Year one of the Capital Homestead Act would issue $7,000 credit per every American citizen. Now we're talking about 300, almost 400 million, or I don't know what the statistic is right now. So all those people would have an account in their individual name in the amount of $7,000 credit. Now that's a lot of money. And how can we channel that money into a new enterprise development?
Under Capital Homestead, you would not first create the money and then invest it. First, you have to come up with the feasible investment. Then the money is created specifically for that.
How do you give everyone the same opportunity, the same $7,000 credit opportunity, and you got 350 million people? That's my point. How do you do that? I understand that the actual money is not issued. It's in a credit account at first.
Well, what you get is not really money. What you get is the right to participate in the creation of money, and it's capped at whatever the annual allocation is. So if somebody goes into a bank and says, "I've got this terrific Capital Homestead investment for $100,000," and the bank or other financial institution will say, "Well, that's nice, but you can only help create up to $7,000."
There would be growth in the professional investment arena, that they would be helping people understand where they can invest that $7,000.
One of the things is that to get back to your point of having a flow diagram, that will help, because one of the things that you're missing is the process, the sequence of events that have to take place before you even determine each citizen is going to be allotted $7,000 of credit. See, it may only be 4. It depends on which participating companies want to be part of this program, and they will say how much they're going to need in order to finance. So it's not a matter of creating $7,000 and now everyone has to kind of search around, and it's like musical chairs that, someone's left, with a whole lot of credit left because we ran out of companies selling shares. That's not the way it works. The company selling shares would be part of the calculation of how much the allocated credit will be. So that's
right, and all I'm saying is that there's going to be few companies initially until this thing takes off.
Right, exactly. So
few people probably.
Yeah, and maybe few people. So the point is, though, that you can use many existing institutions like investment bankers that could interface with companies that want to sell these types of shares, Capital Homestead shares, and you would have the banks would be informed as to, okay, these are going to be the possible investments. You'll have the capital credit insurance companies being aware of, which companies are going to be doing this program. That way there will be various systemic mechanisms to enable anyone who wants to invest their credit in some kind of feasible project. Maybe that one particular company, it gets all the investment it needs. So it may not, need any more, and it won't allow any more capital homesteaders to invest because it just doesn't need, any more. So that capital homesteader who was a little late would go and locate another possible investment. So I think
if they can find it, right?
Yeah. So this is where many different professions can be part of this new systemic change, and they will benefit from this. They're going to have much more business.
There's a lot of different components that have to be clarified in some way in an article with charts or whatever. And then we have to realize that we need to do something now about people, sleeping in rotten sleeping bags on the street and people not being able to get proper health care because they can't afford it. And, kids not being able to go to college because it's so damn expensive now. That's what attracts people to Sandy.
But that's
We're
right.
talking about doing
Gary,
something
that's
now.
exactly why we're doing this right now. This can be, if we can get a CEO, a corporate person, maybe that patriotic millionaires group, somebody on here. This forum right now has helped me even understand little bits and pieces. You talk about it and you have this dialogue and you start learning more about it.
Thanks for listening and have a great week.